Welcome to my weekly Parsha Share. Thank you so much for tuning in or for watching this on YouTube or listening to this on SoundCloud. Don't forget that you can subscribe to my YouTube channel by clicking on the icon at the bottom of your screen. Or you can also subscribe on SoundCloud to make sure that you never miss one of the shiurim. But it's a pleasure to be able to share some Divrei Torah with you this week on Parshat Vayechi. And this week's shiur is in memory of a school friend of mine who very unfortunately, 26 years ago, was killed in a car accident. His name is Uri Pearlman, Rabbi Uri Ephraim ben Rabbi Yosef Yitzchok. His neshama sh'tabn aliyah, we should be zeicha to see tchias hamesim, and this shiur is dedicated le'ilui nishmosoi. Parshat Vayechi is the parsha when Yaakov Avinu passed away. He died. And before he died, he called together all his children. I'm going to read you the pasuk. Vayikra Yaakov el banav. Yaakov called together his children, his sons. Vayomer he'osfu va'agidu lachem es asher yikra eschem b'achris hayomim. He said, gather yourselves together so that I can tell you what will befall you in the end of days. And he goes on to give each and every one of the children of his sons a bracha that's specifically dedicated to them. The Emess LeYaakov, the Ishbitzer, comments on this introductory pasuk. He says it doesn't say, like it says in the case of, for example, Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu, the last parsha of the Torah, is called what? You know what it's called. V'zois habracha. V'zois habracha sheberach Moshe. This is the blessing that Moshe blessed the Jewish people with when he finally was about to depart this world. He wanted to give them a blessing. V'zois habracha, but that's not what it says with Yaakov Avinu. Here it says Vayikra Yaakov el banav vayomer he'osvu v'agidu lachem. It doesn't really speak about brachas, and in fact we're going to see in a minute that some of the things that he said couldn't be considered by any stretch of the imagination to be brachas, and we really need to delve deeper into them to understand them in the context of blessing. Vayikra Yaakov el banav, says the Emess LeYaakov, the Ishbitzer. He says as follows: Kasher rotza Yaakov Avinu levarech es banav. When Yaakov Avinu wanted to bless his children, hayom mesupek im tzarich levarech osam. He was actually in two minds whether or not he should actually give them a blessing. Why? Machmas chesa'aruhu b'mechiras Yosef. He recalled that they had sold Yosef, that they had been involved in this egregious act where they had sold their brother. Are they worthy of receiving a blessing if they sold their brother? And there's a Gemara. The Gemara says as follows: V'amar Rabbi Yochanan mishum Reb Shimon ben Yehoitzadok. The Gemara says, Kol Talmud Chacham she'eino noikem v'noiter. If you are a Talmud Chacham, if you are a great Torah scholar, if you're a holy and righteous person, and you don't take revenge when you have been offended, you've been deliberately targeted in an offensive manner, noikem v'noiter, not just in any way, kenochosh, like a snake, einoi Talmud Chacham, then you can't be considered in that status of being a Talmud Chacham, of being a righteous individual. In other words, you must stand up for yourself. Yaakov Avinu, who was the greatest person of his generation, had been gravely offended, had been gravely hurt by his son's act towards him. By them selling Joseph, his son, they had committed this grave act. He was separated from Yosef for 22 years. And as a result of which, he should really show some level of anger towards them. How could he do that? By not giving them the blessing that he was about to give them. So he was in two minds. Should he or should he not give them the blessing that he was about to give them? As a result of this equivocation on Yaakov's part, it doesn't say like it says with Moshe Rabbeinu v'zois habracha. It says Vayikra. He called them together. He needed to still consider when they were together with him, gathered, whether or not he should give them the blessing. Loshein tza'oka v'kivu b'alev. There's some element of harshness involved in the language of Vayikra. He called them. He kind of summoned them. He didn't say to them in a loving fashion, I want to gather you together to give you a blessing. Vayikra. He was still in two minds as to what he was going to do. Because he was still in two minds. He wanted to see what would happen when the boys were in front of him, the men. They were already, by this time, they were old men. He was a much older man, but they were old men, and he was going to call them together. He wanted to see what would Hashem put in his mouth. Would Hashem allow him to say a blessing, to utter blessings to his sons? And until he knew for sure, he wasn't going to make any commitment as to what he was going to say in terms of blessings or otherwise. And that's why the language, the word bracha isn't used in the introduction here to the Parsha, Perek Memtes of Sefer Bereshis. It says, Vayikra Yaakov Abanav. It doesn't say V'zois HaBracha, as it says with Moshe Rabbeinu at the end of the Torah. Because at that stage he's still not quite sure what he was going to say to them. That I wanted to present to you as a platform, as an introduction to the fact that Yaakov Avinu was totally conscious of what he was about to do. Was it going to be a blessing? Was it not going to be a blessing? How was he going to relate to the boys when they were in front of him, to his sons? Was he going to convey words of blessing or otherwise? And if we look at the initial psukim, if we look at the pronouncements he made, that we refer to as brachas, to Reuven, Shimon and Levi, we see that those pronouncements could not by any stretch of the imagination be described, be defined as blessings. So let's actually look at what Rashi says towards the end of the parsha on Pasuk Chav Ches of Perek Memtes. He says as follows: "V'zois asher diber lahem avihem vayavarech oisam." This is what their father said to them, and he blessed them. So at the end of the parsha, it refers to what had previously been mentioned as blessings. Says Rashi as follows: "V'lo yesh mehem sheloi berachem elo kinturon." There were among the Shavotim, among the sons of Yaakov Avinu, there were those whom he did not bless, but in fact, he rebuked them. He reproached them. That's what the word kinturon means. Elokach perushay. So how are we to explain this? Says Rashi, V'zois asher diber lohem aviyem ma shenemar be'inyon. Yochel shelo verach lir Reuven, Shimon v'Levi, Talmud loma vayavarech oisam kulam b'mashma. You might think as a result of that which we've seen in the parsha that he never blessed them. You should know that that which is recorded in the parsha is something he said to them, but at some point, which is not mentioned here, and Rashi is clearly concerned by the fact that it's being referred to in the parsha as a blessing, but there's no blessing here, and as a result of that, Rashi feels compelled to inform us that there are bits missing from this narrative, namely the actual blessings that Yaakov Avinu gave to his son. That there are blessings which he gave to his sons that are not mentioned in the parsha, and Rashi wants to say that explains why the initial psukim, which seem to be very harsh, very severe, very difficult, they seem to be termed in a language of rebuke, that shouldn't be considered a blessing, that the blessing actually occurred separately and in words that are not recorded in Parshat Vayechi. I'm not going to continue on that vein, other than to say that Rashi continues, Ish asher kavir kosai. The pasuk continues, Ish asher kavir kosai, every man according to his blessing, bracha ha'asida lavai al kol echad ve'echad, according to the blessing that was to come in the future to each and every one of them. Rashi wants to say that the pasuk is hinting at the fact that they were blessed, and that blessing was conveyed to them, and that it happened to them at some point in the future, and it's not recorded here in Parshas Vayechi. Okay, that's Rashi's pshat. That's a literal interpretation, and we're going to see that Rashi has actually an interpretation of the blessing, so-called, of Reuven, that is very harsh and very severe and very difficult to understand. But we're going to go through that, we're going to try and understand it, and we're going to then see one of the most remarkable Chasam Sofers that I have ever seen. Chasam Sofer, of Moshe Sofer, born in Frankfurt, and he was later the Rav in Mattersdorf. He was a Talmud of the Balaflo, he was a Talmud of the Nesher. He later became the Rav in Pressburg, and he became one of the first Gedolei Hador in the sense that he was considered to be the oracle of Orthodox Judaism at a time when Judaism was going through a very difficult period with the advent of Reform Judaism and with the advent of secularization, the Enlightenment, that the Chasam Sofer was a beacon of Jewish light in a world which was immersed in darkness, immersed in a spirit that was overtaking the Jewish traditions that had hitherto been the dominant force of Jewish life. The Chasam Sofer is going to tell us something about Reuven's bracha, which is, I'm telling you, one of the most remarkable Chasam Sofers I have ever seen. I want to thank, in fact, Rabbi Uri Ephraim, who regularly sends out a podcast. He sends a podcast out of the Chasam Sofer, and he sends a podcast out of the Meshech Chochmah. I listen to it every week. But this week, when I heard the Chasam Sofer that he shared, I felt the need to share it with my audience as well. You don't have the podcast of Rabbi Uri Ephraim, and that's why I felt that I should share it with you. So I want to thank him for having shared it with the WhatsApp group that I'm on, so that I can share it with you. And this is the posuk which contains the so-called bracha, the blessing that was received by Reuven from his father Yaakov Avinu. Reuven b'chayri ata. He begins as follows. It's very poetic, by the way. The language that Yaakov Avinu used is extremely poetic. Reuven b'chayri ata. Reuven, you are my firstborn. Koichi v'reishis oini. You are my might and the first fruit of my vigor. Yeser se'es v'yeser oz. Exceeding in rank and exceeding in honor. Very strange. What does he mean? We're not quite sure what he means, but here he comes to the crux of the matter in the next posuk. This is posuk Daled of Perek Memtes. Pachaz kamayim. You are unstable like water. Al toisar ki olisa mishkavei avicha. You shall excel no longer, because when you mounted your father's bed, oz chilalta yitzui ola. You brought disgrace when you mounted my couch. What does he mean? What exactly is this? First of all, can you sense in those words any idea that could be understood as a bracha, as a blessing? I can't. I mean, if you read those words, they don't appear to be in any sense of the word bracha. You can't, bracha is, I want to give you a bracha, that you should be matzliach, that everything you should do should be successful, that you should always be able to achieve all your objectives, etc. That's what a bracha is. A bracha might be in a specific thing. A bracha might be because somebody is sick, you give them a bracha, you should get better, you should have a refuah shalema. Can you sense any idea of bracha in these words of Yaakov Avinu to Reuven, his oldest child? I want to just share with you, Rashi actually conveys the literal interpretation of these psukim, these two psukim about Reuven, and he says it in such a way that we can understand it, because the actual translation of the words of this bracha can't be understood, at least not in a literal sense, but to get some sense of what we call when we look at psukim, as we call the poshut pshat. How do we understand the meaning of the words? If we're looking for the meaning of the words, what does it actually mean? That's what Rashi is trying to convey to us. And let me read it to you. Reuven, says his father Yaakov, B'chayri ato. You are my oldest son. You should be the B'chayr. B'chayri ato. Koichi v'reishis oini. I gave you the Kedusha, the sanctity that would enable you to be the B'chayr, to be this B'chayr, this designated B'chayr, the oldest child, and whatever that status means. And even more than that, Yeser se'es v'yeser oz. You deserve the kahuna, you deserve to get the priesthood from all your brothers, and you deserve the malchus, you deserve to get the royalty. No one had a more promising future than you, Reuven. You were going to get the Bechorah, you were going to get the Kahuna, and you were going to get the Malchus. You're getting everything. But you lost it all. Why? Pachaz kamayim. Because you showed hastiness like water that's running, that's flowing. When you moved around the bed of your father, al toisar, and therefore you have no advantage over your brothers. Even though you were the first, b'chori ata, you have no advantage over your brothers. Ki alisa mishkavei avicha, you moved your father's bed from Bilhah's tent. Bilhah was Rachel's maidservant, and she was the concubine of Yaakov Avinu. And when Rachel died, the bed was moved into the tent of Bilhah, and Reuven was offended for his mother's dignity, for his mother's self-respect, and he moved the bed, Yaakov's bed, from Bilhah's tent to Leah's tent. And you moved your father's bed, says Yaakov Avinu. He knew what happened. He moved the tent from Bilhah's tent to Leah's tent. You thought you were just adjusting your father's sleeping arrangements, but you didn't understand. You had no concept. Oz chilalta yitzui Allah, says the Pasuk. That's what Yaakov Avinu is telling his son. You forgot that God's presence is present over my bed. The Shekhinah is over Yaakov Avinu's bed. How did you think that you had the right to get involved in moving my bed and disrupting the Shekhinah? Clearly, this is due to the fact that Pachaz Kamayim, that you are somebody who's hasty, you're far too hasty, and you're impulsive in the way that you behave. And someone who is impulsive cannot be entrusted with any of the three leading roles of Bnei Yisrael. They can't be the Bechor, they can't have the Kahuna, and they can't have Malchus. That is the so-called bracha of Yaakov Avinu according to the literal translation of the words as presented to us by Rashi. How in heaven's name are we to understand that this is a bracha that Yaakov Avinu, the dying father, is giving to his eldest son, to Reuven, just as he is about to die? How are we to understand that as a bracha? But we saw that the words, it says, Vayevarech, he blessed. Okay, we know that Vayikra. So there is some ambiguity here. But how are we to understand this ambiguity, this tension between the words as they are presented to us and the fact that it is referred to as a bracha, as a blessing? And here is the Chasam Sofer. You're going to adore this. You're going to find this remarkable and marvelous. The Chasam Sofer says something fantastic. Reuven may have lost the Bechorah. He may have lost the Kahuna. He may have lost the Malchus. But there's one part of Avodas Hashem that he never lost, and in which he truly excelled. And behind the literal meaning of the words, Yaakov Avinu is conveying another meaning. There's another translation here. There's another interpretation here, which is the most powerful bracha that anyone can get. A praise that is completely unique to Reuven. It's completely unique to the individual that was receiving it from his father, Reuven. And it is something which is a parallel to the fact that he was a failure, because in one sense and in this sense, he was totally unique, and he became the paradigm for all time as to how one should behave. Reuven b'chori ata, says the Chasam Sofer, nira afal pisha b'loshen kinter ama. Even though he seems to be expressing himself, that Yaakov Avinu is expressing himself in a lashon of rebuke. He's expressing himself in a manner that seems to be telling Reuven off for his behavior. Mikol mokay meruma is behem bracha. There is hinted within those words an incredible blessing. Kedichsiv b'soif ish asher keberkosai berach oisam. Because as it says at the end of the parsha, at the end of Memtes, and we quoted it earlier, each according to that person were they blessed. We know that Reuven's blessing must have been a blessing. So where is the blessing? How are we to understand from the words that Yaakov Avinu uttered that there is a blessing here? V'hinei isa b'medrash. There is a medrash, u'maisele b'slicha de Tzom Gedalia, and if you look at the slichas of Tzom Gedalia, it is mentioned. It's a very, very powerful midrash. What does it say? Omar HaKadosh Baruch Hu leReuven. Listen to this. God said to Reuven, this is obviously, it's an imaginary conversation, but it's so powerful. God says to Reuven, he's focusing on Reuven, and he says as follows, Ata pasachta b'teshuva. You opened the concept of teshuva. You initiated the concept of repentance. Techila, you were the first. You were the first one to realize that there is such a concept of teshuva. Chayecha, I promise you, ben bincha poseach b'tshuva tchila, that your descendant is the one that is going to open up with this concept of teshuva before anyone else. How do we know this? Because we have a prophet called Hosea, and he says as follows: Hosea ben Be'eri, Shuva Yisrael. He is the one that comes up. By the way, Shabbos Shuvah, we say this Haftarah, Shuvah Yisrael, return, repent, Israel. The concept of repentance is in the mouth of the prophet Hosea. Why? Because Reuven is the father of Teshuvah. Reuven is the foundation of Teshuvah. Reuven is the one who initiated the concept of Teshuvah for the Jewish people. Listen carefully to what the Chasam Sofer says, because it's incredibly powerful. Nire, afal pi shenotla b'chayra mireuven al shechota. It would seem that even though the b'chayra, the firstborn status, was removed from Reuven, because of the fact that he sinned, whatever it is that he did, he was no longer worthy of being the Bechor. Nevertheless, Mikol Mokaim, Naseh Bechor L'Teshuva. He never lost his Bechor status when it came to Teshuvah. He was the foundational figure when it comes to repentance, when it comes to doing Teshuvah. V'hischil b'teshuvah tchila. He was the first one ever in the Jewish nation, from the family of Yaakov Avinu, to do Teshuvah. Everything that we know about Teshuvah was learnt from Reuven. He was a person who regretted his actions and did Teshuvah for them. V'choshev Yosef Yitzchok, and therefore he is considered to be greater than any righteous individual, because someone who does Teshuvah is considered greater than a tzaddik. Really? Yes, it's a Gemara. It's a Gemara in Brachos Lamed Daled Omid Beis says that where there is a Baal Teshuvah, no tzaddik, gomor, even the most righteous individual, cannot be in that place. A Baal Teshuvah has a more powerful impact on the world than somebody who's never done anything wrong and is perfectly righteous. Nimtzat tzaddik mukdam bizman. Now, it could be that you'll say, what are you talking about? The tzaddik came first because they were a tzaddik before the Baal Teshuvah became a tzaddik. They were always a tzaddik. They never did anything wrong. Or Baal Teshuvah mu'uchar le bizman. He only came later. The fact that he's a tzaddik was later. Because it's not possible to become a tzaddik after you've been a chayte without doing the chait first. You have to have sinned first in order to become the Baal Teshuvah and to be the tzaddik. So how do we explain this idea that in the place of a Baal Teshuvah a tzaddik cannot be? How do we understand that? Nimtza she'u me'uchar bizman. It could be that he only became a tzaddik later. Ava mukdam b'ma'al. He is in a higher status in terms of his achievement. Do you know why? Because he's tasted chait. He is somebody who's been in that world that's imperfect, and he's extricated himself from it, or herself from it. They have managed to bring themselves out of the dark situation of chait, of sin, they've managed to emerge from that and become tzaddikim. It's all very well for somebody who's never had the sin or tasted sin to remain a tzaddik, but for somebody who has tasted sin, who's been immersed in that world, and to come out of it and say, I'm no longer a sinner, they are greater than the greatest tzaddik. They have achieved something that no tzaddik can achieve. Al-Kain Omar Yaakov Avinu, and therefore Yaakov Avinu tells his son Reuven, it's so powerful. You're going to love this. He says to his son Reuven, Reuven b'chayri ata. Not you were my b'chayr. You remain my b'chayr. You are still my b'chayr. You are my b'chayr in teshuvah. You remain the most powerful emblem, the most powerful paradigm, the most powerful exemplar of what it means to be a Baal Teshuvah. You, Reuven, are still my Bechor. You may not be my Bechor in terms of other aspects of what it means to be a Bechor, but in terms of your leading example, you are Bechor in Teshuvah. Bereshis Oini. What does the word Oini mean? The Pasuk in Tehillim Nun Tes, Pasuk Gimel, it says, Poyel Oven, says the Chasam Sofer. You were a sinner. You started off Reishis Oini. You began as a sinner. Your beginning was as somebody who had done something wrong. Hamishapech lezchus asher hu yeseh ala se'es. But you then emerged from that status, and you exceeded. You exceeded your brothers in terms of having risen up out of this negative situation, and you became a positive, the yeser ala ois, and you became more than just the ordinary. You are mighty in terms of your ability to conquer the sin that you tasted. You became the Baal Teshuvah. You choshev mikahuna or malchus, and you should know, it doesn't matter. Somebody can be a kohen, even the kohen gadol. Somebody can be from the royal family. They can even be a melech. They'll never reach your status of a Baal Teshuvah. They'll never get there. You are yeser se'es, and you're yeser ha'oz. You see what the Chasam Sofer has done here? He's used the same language that was the language of rebuke, and he's turned that into a kind of a parallel translation into a language of praise, into a language of building somebody up. You were the Bechor. You might think that's a negative, because you were the Bechor and you were fantastic. You were headed for who knows what. You were going to be the superior member of the family. No, that's not what he's saying. He's saying that on one level, he's saying you failed, and on another level, he's saying you succeeded. The ultimate form of success. Bechori ata yeser se'es and yeser ha'oz. You're better than kahuna. You're better than Malchus. Do you know why? Because you are a Baal Teshuvah. Ki hu choshuv meha-kahuna u'meha-malchus. It's more important, it's more impressive. What you have achieved is much more impressive than being a king or being a kohen or being a priest. You are a Baal Teshuvah. Look at you, Reuven. Look at what you have become. Despite the fact that you lost everything, you have emerged more powerful and more impactful than any other one of your brothers. Ach pachas kamayim al toisar. You should know that oisoi heter einenu pachas umar kamayim. The fact that the oisar hayeser einenu pachas umar kamayim. That this aspect of your personality, the fact that you did something that you were impulsive, al toisar. Why? Ki im ba'achriz. It doesn't come quickly. It's not something that emerges quickly. You should know some of the pachas kamayim. That may be something that you're known for because you sinned quickly. But the fact is, what you did is something that can never happen at the beginning, because you can't become a Baal Teshuvah before you've done an Aveira. And therefore, your pachas kamayim is something that is not related to the fact that ki oz chilalta yitzue oviv. It's only the oz in the future that you are able to change things around. Ki bilti zeloi hoya efshar lashuv. It's only as a result of the fact that you moved around the bed of your father that you become what you are now. You have a unique status. Reuven, do you know who you are? You are the emblematic Bal Tshuva. You are the hero of the Jewish people. You are the hero of Teshuvah for the Jewish nation for all time. You're the first one to do it. And that's what it means when it says in the Medrash, it says that you are ata posachta b'teshuvah tchila. You are the first one. You are the Bechoir of Teshuvah, which is why Hosea becomes the Novi that is quoted in Tanakh as saying, Shuva Yisrael, you are the headquarters of Teshuvah for all time. Now, does that sound like something which is rebuke? Not really. That sounds like incredible praise. It's words of encouragement from his father. Now, it's couched in terminology that could be thought of as rebuke, but when you look at it again, you realize how incredibly powerful these words are in terms of building Reuven up. Reuven, you're special. Reuven, you are unique. Yes, you did something wrong, but as a result of doing that thing wrong, you have become better than all your brothers in one aspect. And this, by the way, is going to relate to something I'm going to say later on, which is that each one of the Shvatim, the bracha that they received from Yaakov Avinu, was not something which was just a random piece of information. It reflected a unique contribution that this Shevet, that this son of Yaakov Avinu was giving to the Jewish people, not just then, but for all time. And this idea that there's a range of contributions. It's not one. It's not, the uniform. Being a Jew isn't uniform. You don't have to be the same Jew as everybody else. There's a Reuven, there's a Shimon, there's a Levi, there's a Yehuda, all the way through to Binyamin. Every single Shevet has something unique to offer to the Jewish people, and that uniqueness in terms of Reuven was his ability. He contributed this power of Teshuvah to the Jewish people for all time. Let's look at the Emess LeYaakov of Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky. He says he focuses on this aspect of the differentiation between the Shvatim, but the fact that all of these aspects have to come together. Vayikra Yaakov el bonav vayomer he'osvu va'agida lachem. Yaakov called his sons and he says, gather together, I'm going to tell you something. He kovtzu v'shimu v'nei Yaakov, come together, be together in a kibbutz, as it were, a commune is the word we use for kibbutz, but it doesn't really translate. It means gather together, be together, join forces with each other, and listen, Bnei Yaakov, listen, the sons of Yaakov. Says the Emess LeYaakov, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, Zichrono Livrocha, Ein b'medrash shekosav v'zel hashoin. The medrash says as follows: V'Rabbanan Omri, the rabbis inform us, Tziva oison ala machloikus. You know what Yaakov Avinu was telling them right at the beginning when he introduced the idea of the brachas that he was about to give them? He told them about disputes, about disagreements, about arguments. Ama lahoin tiyu kulchain asifa achas. He told them, whatever it is, whatever your differences may be, you always have to be one part of a larger whole. You have to belong to the group. That's what it means when it says hey osfu. That's what it means when it says he kovtzu. Biur hadvarim says the Emess LeYaakov as follows: I've already explained. She'ikar kavanose shel Yaakov. Do you know what Yaakov had in mind when he was talking to his sons? Koidem predose, before he left this world. He wanted to focus on this faith that we need to have in the ultimate redemption that was going to occur. And therefore, he gave, when you have an army, you have an air force, you have a navy, you have the infantry, you have the tanks, you have all the different elements of the army, and they all come together, all focused on the same goal. They need to win the war. The same was with Yaakov Avinu. He sees before him 12 sons, each of whom has unique abilities, unique qualities, but he wants each one to focus on their qualities. He wanted to give them each their directions, their orders, as it were. He is now the commander-in-chief, and he wants to make sure that they get to the Geula HaAmitis, and in order to do so, each one of them has to focus on their tafkid, on their unique ability, be'eretz Yisrael, b'chlal Yisrael, whether it's in terms of the Jewish nation, or whether it's in terms of what they did in the land of Israel when they're going to inherit the land and eventually make it out of Egypt. Kol echad kibel mimenu hadracha, each one of them received specific direction, le'osid b'time each one of them receives the directions that they need to receive in order to understand what it is that they need to do, that they need to contribute in order to achieve the ultimate objective. Kalal Yisrael, lefi machshavas Yaakov Avinu. Klal Yisrael, the Jewish nation, according to what Yaakov Avinu thought, this is a very interesting idea. Yaakov Avinu understood that there's no such thing as uniformity in terms of a large group of people. People have different opinions. There's many different ways of achieving the same objective. And Yaakov Avinu realized that you can't tell everybody, okay, this is the only way to do it, and there's no other way to achieve this objective. He understood that each person has their own qualities and their own understanding of the way things should work, and that the fact that there's a difference of opinion doesn't mean that they have to divide into smaller groups. They can come together in one group, but they can still be in disagreement about the way to run things. There can be chilukei deis beinehem. Ela adarabba, tafkidam hu lichyois biyachad kishnei masa shvatim nifrodim. They have to live together as 12 separate tribes. There has to be differences there has to be, I guess, cultural differences, different ways of doing things between the 12 tribes of Israel. Kol echad v'tafkidai ha'ishi, each one of them and their particular unique characteristics, avol kachelek bilti nifrad me'atzibur. Even though they're different, they must be connected to the congregation. They must be connected to the larger whole. Lefi tzava'osei shel Yaakov, osur hoya l'shevet echad lis'arei b'tchumei shel shevet acher. But what Yaakov Avinu was saying is, don't try and take over. Don't try and become what the other one is. You know, it's like if you're a lawyer, don't try and become an accountant. And if you're an accountant, don't try and be a doctor. And if you're a doctor, don't be a philosopher. You are qualified specifically in your area of expertise, and you must remain totally focused on that area of expertise in order to achieve the broader objectives of the whole. If there is a doctor who cures people, they'll cure philosophers, accountants, and lawyers. And if there's a lawyer who can make sure to advocate for people in difficulty, then it's going to help people who are doctors who need a lawyer. Now, if the lawyer wants to be a doctor and the doctor wants to be a lawyer, then suddenly everybody is in it for themselves. They don't need any other segment of society. Yaakov Avinu is telling you, you need different expertise. You need different elements, different segments of society. You need every single type of person, as Moshe Rabbeinu made so clear when he says, Atem nitzovim hayom kulchem. At the end of Parshat of Sefer Dvarim, he talks to the Jewish nation. He says, even the water carriers, or let's put it in our language, the garbage collectors, they're as important as the doctors. We may not treat them that way, but if you don't have people collecting your garbage, then the garbage will pile up. If everybody in the world was a doctor, then you would never be able to get rid of your garbage. You need to be able to get rid of your trash. You also need doctors who can cure you. Every aspect of a society plays such an important role in the functioning of that society. And each one within their role is unique, and at the same time they pull together to create the greater whole. And that's what Yaakov Avinu was telling his children. I'm now going to call you together. Hikovtzu and Heosvu, gather together. I'm going to tell you each your individual qualities. Ki kol shevet noyed letafkid miyuchad. Each one of you, as gathered together as you may be, have your unique quality, your unique function in terms of the greater whole. V'lochein nenshu hachashmonaim. And this is an interesting point. That was the reason why the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees, were punished. The Chashmonaim were punished. Why? Sheba'u mishevet Levi. They came from the Leviim. They weren't kings. They shouldn't have been ra'ui lemalchus. That's not what they were meant to be. And when they took the royal status into their jurisdiction, Because we know that Shevet Yehuda were the ones who were designated to be the royal family. It was not meant to be the Shevet Levi, and when they took it, they got themselves into trouble. Their punishment was the worst punishment that we can even imagine. They were written out of Jewish history in terms of we don't know any of any descendants of the Chashmonaim who are still active in the Jewish world. They were written out of they may exist in terms of our celebration of Hanukkah, but in real terms, in being part of the Jewish system, they're no longer there. Ki haloi zerach Chashmonaim kola ve'ovad min ha'olam. We know that the descendants of the Chashmonaim were completely obliterated from the Jewish world. They no longer exist. And that's because they took over, they invaded the territory of another Shevet. Each Shevet got its own tafkid, so that they can pull together, each of those tafkidim can pull together to be part of a greater whole. And as we've already mentioned, even though each one of those Shavatim received their particular skill, as it were, they were designated for what it was that their function should be in terms of the Jewish people. They must never forget that just because they've got their individual qualities, let's say Yehuda is the one that's the royal family, Levi is the one that's the kahuna, they're the ones who have to look after the temple duties, etc. And Yisachar is the one that has to take care of the study of Torah. And Zvulun is the one who has to take care of supporting the study of Torah. Each one has their own tafkid in terms of what they have to be. And we said before, Reuven is the one who's meant to convey this concept of teshuvah. Each shevet has their unique capability that they have to convey or that they have to bring to the table in terms of the Jewish nation. They mustn't forget, must never forget that they are part of a greater whole. They must respect, they must honor the way of the other Shvatim in terms of how they conduct themselves in the service of God. It's specifically so that they can focus and underline and underscore this particular aspect of the Jewish world, of the Jewish people. In other words, he wanted them to know this, and that's why he called them together using the word he'osvu, gather together, come together, be together. You're different. You might separate if you weren't told that it's important to be together. However, says Yaakov Avinu, he'osvu, be together, hikobtsu. Be together. Be part of a greater whole. Don't think that your unique characteristic, your unique selling point, your USP makes you special and separate, and therefore the rest of Klal Yisrael is not important. No, you can function in your function and they function in their function, and each function is important as part of the greater whole. Kolema, kol echad me'ha'achim ha'yanoichach b'sha'ah shediber Yaakov b'protius im kol shevet. Each one of the Shvatim was addressed by Yaakov Avinu according to their unique ability, their unique characteristic, but always as part of a greater whole. And this is why Yaakov said to each one of them, that's why they're all there together. They need to hear what it is that the other brothers specialize in. What's their specialty? What is the aspect of who they are that makes them unique and makes them so important in the united vision that we have for each other and for the future. And therefore they should all be, they didn't call them in separately. He didn't say, come in you and the others should be behind a closed door. No, gather all together. Reuven, you're Mr. Tshuva. Yehuda, you're Mr. Malchus. Levi, you're Mr. Kahuna. Yisachar, Zvulun, you're Mr. Torah, you're Mr. Supporter of Torah. He didn't say it to them separately, he said it to them all together, that they could all hear what it was that their unique abilities were, and to understand that it's always part of that we have to pull together to be part of a greater whole. Kach Even though you mustn't try, Yisachar, you mustn't try and be Zevulun. And Zevulun, you mustn't try and be Yisachar. And Yehuda, you shouldn't try to be Levi. And Levi, you shouldn't try to be Yehuda. But nevertheless, you need to know what each one is in order to understand what their unique ability should be and how it is important in the greater whole, in the greater good of the Jewish people. Mikol Mokom, Yodoya Tedu, you need to know. Ki kulchem shayochim letzibur echad. You're all part of one larger group of people, of this nation that we call Klal Yisrael, that we call the children of Israel, that we refer to as Knesset Yisrael. That is so important. You may have unique abilities, but nevertheless, those unique abilities pull together to become part of a greater whole. I want to end with a beautiful piece from my grandfather's Sefer, Mikdash HaLevi. Reuven, back to Reuven b'chori ata koichi v'reishis only yeser se'es v'yeser oz. You know that Reuven, as it sounds like, is getting chastised. He's getting rebuked. He's being reproached by his father, Yaakov Avinu. Says my grandfather, Rav Yosef Rabbi Dunner, in his Sefer Mikdash HaLevi. We just published the 6th edition of this Sefer. I don't know if it's yet available in a bookstore near you, but I would seek it out. It's one of the most wonderful Sfarim, the Parsha, that is available. It's so easy to understand. The Hebrew is very easy, and the ideas that my grandfather conveys in this Sefer are so special and so wonderful. We see that when Yaakov approached his children and brought them in so that he could bless them before he died, he turns to his 3 eldest children, and Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, he gives them really tough language, very severe, very difficult. He's not easy on. He doesn't give them an easy time. He tells Reuven that he's hasty, and he tells Shimon and Levi that they didn't behave nicely when it came to the story of Shechem. They murdered the entire city. He's not happy with them, at least in the literal understanding of the word. Says my grandfather, we should be stunned at this. These are presented to us as brachas. Really? These are the blessings that he gives his children before he dies? They don't sound like blessings at all. He tells them off. You're calling them in, you're about to die. You're telling them off. Give them a blessing, just give them a straight blessing. The things that he said to them cannot be possibly interpreted as blessings. Obviously putting aside the Chasam Sofer's interpretation, which isn't literal, but which is drush. If you look at the translation of the words, he's giving them a tough time. Perhaps what he's saying to them is a curse. He's telling them that they're useless, that they're nebuchs, that they can never succeed in life because of the way that they've behaved, and they're going to go forward and be totally unsuccessful. To my grandfather's presenting these brachas, he's saying, how is it possible to understand them as brachas at all? We're seeking out, when we look at these words, we'd like to think that when Yaakov is about to die, and in these moments, Yaakov is about to depart from his sons, he would talk about their qualities, how great they are, how marvelous they are, and not talk about the fact that they're useless and terrible and that they've done everything wrong. And we see that that's exactly what he did after Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. For the rest of the sons, he speaks very nicely about them. So why does he give these first 3 children such a tough time? And how can we interpret that as being a bracha? Venira, says my grandfather in his Sefer, Mikdash HaLevi, Shebracha Gedola Birech Yaakov Esbonov. That Yaakov gave his sons an incredible bracha, an incredibly powerful bracha. Shekain af shelamaris ayin nira lanu kitoichacha geluya. Even though it appears to us, just in the basic understanding of the words, that he's reproaching them and rebuking them, giving them a tough time. It seems to us the complete opposite of what we would define as a blessing. In fact, that's not the way it is at all. Habrocha hagadola b'Yosef. Do you know what? You want to know what the greatest blessing is? Dafka teichecha hazu shechiach Yaakov es bonav. It's this teichecha, it's this rebuke that Yaakov gives his children, exposing them to their greatest flaws, to the difficulties that they encounter in their personality that brings them to do the things that they shouldn't be doing. Shekein be'emtziusa, who ifshar lahem letaken es darkehem mikam ve'elech, but because he's saying it to them now, they're going to really listen to him. The father is on his deathbed, and he's saying to them, listen, I want to tell you something. You know what your vulnerability is? Pachas kamaim, he says to Reuven. You know what you are? You're somebody who's a little too hasty. You want to have blessings in your life? Stop being so hasty. And what about Shimon and Levi? Do you know what your problem is? You're violent. You have a bad temper. You're people who do things which are violent and aggressive because you don't control your temper. Do you want to be successful in life? You want a bracha in your life? Stop losing your temper. Stop getting so angry. That's what it means. If from now on, because they know what they've done wrong, they're going to be enabled to do the right thing for the future. They'll be worthy of a blessing forevermore. Sometimes the best thing that we can hear is the thing that we least want to hear. Sometimes what we need to hear in order to have blessings in our lives are the things that ensure that we are never going to be blessed, because we behave in a particular way that prevents us from achieving our best version of ourselves. And the greatest blessing that Reuven could hear was that he was a pachas kamayim. You know what? Reuven needed to hear those words from his father at this seminal moment, at this important moment. He needed to hear, I have a problem. And therefore, if I want to be blessed, I've got to go to therapy and deal with that problem. I've got to make sure that that problem is no longer a problem. That is the greatest blessing of all. Sometimes we need to confront our vulnerabilities, our weaknesses, so that we can really tap into our strengths and be the strongest version of ourselves that it is possible to be. Thank you so much for listening. I wish you all the best. And in anticipation of Shabbat Shalom, I look forward to you joining me for a future Parsha Share.